My parents sold the house and gave me 30 days to leave. Now I'm lost. I had always known that I was an inconvenience. Not because my mother said it outright. No, she was far too refined for that. But in the way she lingered in doorways when I spoke, as if measuring the time wasted on me. In the way she sighed when I entered a room, heavy and drawn out, as if my very presence weighed her down. But this was a new level of detachment, one I hadn't expected, even from her. "You have 30 days to move out," she had said, her lips curling in that signature smirk of hers, the one she reserved for news that she found amusing but knew would devastate someone else. We sold the house. Sold the house. Not our house. Not the house I had spent my entire life in. The house where I had broken my arm falling from the oak tree in the backyard, where I had buried my first dog under the rose bushes, where I had paced the halls as a teenager, desperate to be anywhere else. No, it was simply the house now, a commodity to be exchanged. A piece of property that no longer had any ties to me. My mother, Callista, had never been one for sentimentality. Practicality, yes. Ruthlessness, certainly. But never sentimentality. My father, Warren, had been different once, or at least I like to believe so. Before he shrank into the shell of himself, before he stopped fighting back. Now he was a bystander in his own life, his presence in our family a mere formality. And then there was my brother, Dorian, the golden child, the one who had done everything right. He had moved away, married a woman from a good family, had children who wore matching sweaters at Christmas. I, on the other hand, had stayed. Not because I wanted to, God, no, but because every time I tried to leave, something pulled me back. A job that fell through, a car that broke down, an opportunity that never quite panned out. And so I remained stagnant, stuck in a house that wasn't even mine anymore. The thing about being told to leave a place you've lived your whole life is that it forces you to confront the weight of everything you've accumulated. The furniture, the clothes, the old books collecting dust on the shelves, those are easy. You pack them into boxes, haul them away. But then there are the other things, the things that can't be neatly categorized. The years of disappointment that hang in the air like an odor, the resentment that seeps into the walls, the ghosts of every moment you wished had gone differently. I had 30 days to unspool the tangled mess of my existence in this house. 30 days to erase any trace of myself from its rooms. 30 days to figure out where the hell I was supposed to go. First, I thought about fighting it. I thought about asking why, about demanding an explanation. But I already knew the answer. This was what my mother did. She cut off dead weight. She excised the things that no longer served her. I was simply another outdated fixture in a house she no longer had use for. The first few days, I walked through each room, trying to see it as a stranger would. The living room with its stiff leather couches that no one ever actually sat on. The dining room, where elaborate meals were served with icy conversation. My bedroom, still cluttered with remnants of a boyhood that had long since expired. I started with the easy things, the closet, the drawers, the suits I had bought for job interviews that had gone nowhere, the college textbooks I had never really needed. But then there were the things I hadn't expected to feel so attached to. The baseball glove with my initials stitched into the leather, a gift from my father when he still believed I'd be something more than what I was. The framed photo of me and Dorian as kids, before we learned to hate each other. The stack of birthday cards from my grandmother, the only person who had ever made me feel like I truly belonged to this family. I told myself that this was a blessing in disguise, that I should have left years ago, that maybe this was the push I needed to finally become someone other than the man who still lived in his childhood home. But the truth was I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to walk out of these doors for the last time, to become a stranger to the only life I had ever known. And yet time moved forward. The days slipped through my fingers, and my presence in the house became more of an intrusion than ever. My mother stopped acknowledging me entirely, as if I had already faded into the past. My father avoided my eyes, shame or guilt or indifference. I couldn't tell which. Dorian didn't call. He didn't need to. I could already hear his voice in my head, telling me that this was my own fault, that I had done nothing with my life, that I had brought this on myself. On the 12th day, I found myself standing in the backyard, staring at the oak tree I had once fallen from. The scars on my arm had faded, but the memory remained, sharp and vivid. I had climbed too high, reaching for something just out of grasp, and the branch had snapped beneath me. My mother had scolded me, told me I should have known better. My father had bandaged my arm in silence. It had always been like that. Me reaching, them watching me fall. I had 18 days left, and I had no idea where I was going to land. I had 18 days left. 18 days to make sense of a life that had never truly belonged to me. The house itself began rejecting me, or maybe I was finally seeing it for what it had always been. A place where I was tolerated, not wanted. The air was thick with indifference. My mother's presence, once oppressive, had turned ghostly. She no longer addressed me, not even in passing, not even with a glance. My father had perfected the art of disappearing. I could hear him in the mornings, the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had made himself a shadow in his own home. The sound of his coffee spoon clinking against the porcelain, the rustling of the newspaper he never really read. I avoided them both. I moved through the house like a trespasser, careful not to leave behind anything more than necessary. Packing became an exercise in restraint. At first, I clung to things, stuffing boxes with objects I thought I couldn't bear to leave behind. But the more I packed, the more I realized how little of it actually mattered. The books I had bought but never read. The framed certificates from schools that had promised me a future I had never managed to reach. The ties I had worn to interviews where my handshake had been too firm, my voice too eager, my smile too unsure. Some things were harder to let go of. The childhood drawings stuffed in the back of my desk drawer, still wrinkled and faded with time. A single cassette tape, one I had recorded as a kid, narrating my grand plans for the future. Plans that now felt like the delusions of a stranger. I threw most of it away. I left the boxes half empty. The house itself had begun to change. My mother had wasted no time preparing it for its new owners. The furniture was rearranged, the walls repainted, the old carpets ripped up. It was unsettling, watching the remnants of our life stripped away layer by layer. The house felt sterile, like a showroom, like something that had never belonged to me in the first place. Dorian called once. I let it go to voicemail. I knew what he would say, that I should be grateful, that it was time for me to move on, that this was my fault. And maybe he was right. Maybe I had been waiting too long for something that was never going to come. Some kind of apology, some acknowledgement that I had mattered, even a little. But there was nothing left to wait for. On the 10th day, I found myself driving with no destination. The city had always felt suffocating, but now it felt hostile, as if it knew I had nowhere else to go. I passed through neighborhoods where people had places to be, jobs to return to, families that welcomed them home. I had none of those things. I pulled into a gas station and sat there, staring at the numbers on the pump, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. It would be so easy to just keep driving, to put miles between myself and everything that had ever disappointed me. But where would I go? The question had no answer, just an empty echo that filled the space in my chest. I returned to the house that night, slipping in quietly as if I didn't belong there. And maybe I didn't anymore. My mother had thrown out my old bedding, replacing it with something neutral, something impersonal. A reminder that I was already gone, even if my body was still there. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the past pressing down on me. My mind wandered to all the things I should have done differently, all the choices that had led me here. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that I had tried so hard, only to end up discarded like an afterthought. But fairness had never been part of the equation. I had 8 days left. 8 days before I became a ghost with no home to haunt. I had 8 days left. 8 days before I became a ghost with no home to haunt. The final week unraveled like a slow, suffocating dream. The house continued to transform, erasing every trace of my existence. The walls were bare now, the pictures removed, the shelves emptied. Even the smell was different, the familiar scent of dust and worn leather replaced by fresh paint and chemical cleaners. It was as if the house had never been lived in, as if my childhood had been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience to the structure itself. I barely slept. My mind churned, restless and hollow, thoughts looping back on themselves, leading nowhere. I kept revisiting old moments, trying to pinpoint the exact place where I had gone wrong. Had it been when I decided not to go to college out of state? When I took that dead-end job instead of pursuing something bigger? When I allowed myself to believe, even for a second, that I could carve out a place here, in this family, in this home? The nights were the hardest. Lying in that bed that no longer felt like mine, in a room that had been stripped of anything resembling me, I felt the weight of years pressing down. The ghosts of childhood laughter, of teenage arguments, of quiet, unspoken disappointments. They were all here, woven into the very foundation of the house. And yet, I was the one being forced to leave. On the 5th day, I started taking longer drives, filling the hours with motion just to avoid being in the house. I drove past places I had long since stopped visiting. Old diners, the baseball field where I had spent summers as a kid, the bridge where I had once kissed a girl I thought I'd love forever. Everything had changed, but I hadn't. I was still stuck in the past, still searching for something that had disappeared long ago. I stopped at a storage facility and rented a unit, though I had no real plan for what I would do with it. I moved the boxes there, stacking them in neat, meaningless piles, trying to convince myself that I wasn't just postponing the inevitable. What did it matter? I had no job lined up, no apartment waiting, no plan, just a deadline. 3 days left. My mother had started speaking to me again, but only in clipped, businesslike statements. Reminders of what needed to be done. A deadline to return the house key. A thinly veiled suggestion that I not linger once I was gone. My father didn't say anything at all. He sat in his usual chair, staring out the window, lost in whatever thoughts occupied him now. I wondered if he even cared that I was leaving, if he had ever truly cared at all. 2 days left. I stood in the backyard, staring at the oak tree one last time. The branches had grown wild over the years, stretching toward the sky in defiance. The scar on my arm itched as I traced my fingers over it, remembering the fall, the pain, the way my mother had sighed as if I had inconvenienced her by breaking myself. Some wounds never healed properly. They just faded, waiting to be reopened. 1 day left. I packed the last of my things into the car. A single duffel bag, a few boxes in the trunk. That was all my life amounted to now. I stood at the door for a long time, staring at the empty house, at the walls that had once held so much history but now meant nothing. My mother passed by without a word. My father didn't look up. Dorian hadn't called again. There was nothing left to wait for. I stepped outside, the air thick with the weight of something final. I turned the key in the lock one last time, holding on to the moment, trying to feel something. Anger, sadness, relief. But there was nothing. Just the sound of the door clicking shut, sealing away the past behind me. I had no idea where I was going, but I was finally gone.